I want you to think of the place that you call home. Think of the familiar shops in the area that you go to, the services you know. When we moved back from Melbourne, it was great because we'd lived here before, so we knew where the doctors and the specialists were. Think of the sounds of the place where you live, the house of perhaps of many, many years. What's the smell of dinner cooking like? And then imagine that you lose it. How devastating that is. What's it like to have no home? A sense of home is important to human beings. We have a need to know that we belong where we are, to have an established place in the world. It's what makes the housing crisis such an issue now, and what makes it so difficult when in our vulnerable stages of life we suddenly have to think about changing our residence. It's why younger generations despair when it feels to them like they're not ever going to be able to afford it. Owning houses, having a home, kind of makes it more permanent than rental situations ever are. And there's a sense of comfort and well-being that comes from that. And that need also extends to the neighbourhoods, the cities, the states, the countries in which we feel at home. Again, I realised this when we moved back from Melbourne and go, we'd live in a part where I'd already lived and go, we are home. To have a place means at its best that we have security, familiarity, peace, safety, the ability to rest and kind of really rest. At its best, we have a feeling of belonging, of being loved, of being valued in that place. It's a safe place from which we reach out to the rest of the world. And of course, our sense of place can also be treated a little more metaphorically. Sometimes we gain a sense of where we fit, our security, our identity from other things. Those who have large bank accounts often feel more at home in the world than those who do not. We may try to build our sense of place through our achievements. These are the things that I have done. They give me a sense that I belong here. Or maybe through the recognition of other people. When other people say that I'm good, that I'm in the right place. Through developing skills or abilities, through relationships often, and our network of contacts. To be in a place where you know the people to go to, where you have friends and support. All of those contribute to this sense of belonging, of safety and home. And this sense, this longing for a place to belong is nothing new. In the ancient world, in the time of Abraham, cities provided exactly that. Cities were where you were well defended. Cities were where you could get the things that you needed, where you could settle, where you could be stable, and there were structures around to support life, that a mere stumble wasn't going to create disaster for you. The cities gave people a sense of stability and solidity in the environment. And remember, in the ancient world, they did not feel at home in the world the way that we do, because they didn't have all the technology that we have, and therefore the wilderness was really wild. When you were in a city, it was a place of safety and stability, not of wild unpredictability. But whether it was Abraham's time 4,000 years ago or today, the reality is that our sense of place can be terribly fragile. One of the interesting things is that many of the cities that are mentioned in the story of Abraham and in the Old Testament, either now we don't know where they were, or if we do, they're archaeological dig sites, not functioning cities. Some of the churches that are mentioned in the book of Revelation, there's several of them that no longer exist at all. They are now just archaeological sites. There are some where there's a city nearby, but they've kind of moved up the road and the site's an archaeological site. And there's 3 of them, I think, are still actually now functioning cities under different names. The fact is that all places of stability, All the places that are planned and built by human hands are subject to decay and the passing of time. We build houses that I think in our minds it never seems to occur to us that these won't last forever. But our houses have expiry dates. And in so many of the suburbs around our area now, you can see the expiry dates of houses because they're being bulldozed and new ones are being put in. And no doubt the new owners build them as if they're going to last forever. But in what? 50, 80, 100 years? Those too will be being bulldozed in time for new ones. We can have a sense of solidity, but we might be powerful figures in our professional workspace, but too often we get left behind by new developments. Or we retire, and as one bishop said to me after his retirement, he said, "I'm suffering from relevance deprivation because I am now relevant to nobody and I'm used to being relevant to a whole state full of people." Wealth comes and goes. Hyperinflation changes the difference between rich and poor. I had a neighbour who after World War II he told me that after World War II he had wallpapered his house with his banknotes because it was more efficient and more cost-effective to use the money to wallpaper and insulate his house than it was to use that money to spend on anything. He used to talk about going just a normal little grocery shop. He would take a wheelbarrow of money to be able to buy things with. And so a man who had been incredibly wealthy found himself pretty much on the same level as anyone else. All of us, by age and circumstance, may find our place in the world is vulnerable. We too often tie our security, our identity to particular things only to have them pass away. Mobility, turns out, is not such a given as I once thought it was. And this is why the book of Hebrews offers us a different kind of city, a different kind of place, a place of stability and well-being. Hebrews speaks of an eternal city and a place that will last. Hebrews views Abraham as the father of all who have faith in God. And therefore, as it tells this story of Abraham and Sarah, and in the rest of chapter 11, many of the other Old Testament saints, it's telling the story of all who are connected to God through faith and through Christ. This is really just the continuation of what it was saying in chapter 10, where it tells us to draw near to God with a true heart in full assurance of faith. And it exhorts us there to hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Abraham is then used as an example of faith that receives the promises of God. Abraham had been promised many things by God. God had promised to make of him a great nation, to make his name great, to make him a blessing to others. But to do all that, Abraham trusted God. At first, all that God said to him originally was, "Go from your country, from your people, from your father's household to a land that I will show you." He needed to find his sense of security and his sense of place in God and in God's promise. That's the trust that set him free to leave behind all those things that in the ancient world would have meant security and place and belonging and safety and wealth. To leave behind his country, his people, and his father's house where he was so established. Not only that, but God sent him out and promised to make of him a great nation, and Abraham had to trust God's promise that God could create life even when it didn't seem humanly possible. Abraham and Sarah were already beyond childbearing age when Abraham left his home. And even more beyond childbearing age when God made the promise of descendants. And so, not even knowing where he was going, Abraham set out because he found his sense of place in the promises of God, because he found that God was trustworthy. God then, in the process, revealed to Abraham the land in which his descendants were, which he was to have descendants, and which his descendants were to receive, but which Abraham only ever lived in as a dweller in tents. There was no city in the promised land for Abraham. The only land that he ever owned in the promised land was the plot of ground that he bought for the burial of his wife Sarah. And yet, when he had God's promise, Abraham knew that the gift would come about, and so he could rejoice in his possession of the land because he was so sure of it, because God had promised it, even when he didn't in fact own any of the land. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and God did give that land to his descendants. But Hebrews 11 doesn't limit its vision to the physical land. It says that Abraham was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Ultimately, the real land of promise for Abraham was the better country. Hebrews calls it the better country, that is a heavenly one. Hebrews looks at the whole list of people who have died in faith and said, not having received the things promised, but they had seen them and greeted them from afar. It's like they'd come in sight, like Moses on the mountain, overlooking the promised land. And he knows that God is delivering his promise, even though he himself is not going to receive it. And they see that city, and they knew that the city of God was for them, even though at the moment they did not inhabit it. And they acknowledge then that for the moment they were strangers and aliens on earth, because Hebrews says they desired a better country, that is a heavenly one. And therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. God has prepared for them a city, and they long for that city, and therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. He owns them, and they own him, and he owns them with joy. By faith, Abraham was able to see the promise of God that would be fulfilled to him. Yes, initially in earthly terms through his descendants, but ultimately in heavenly terms as God created an eternal abode for him. So certain was Abraham's faith that it did, as Hebrews says, gave substance to his hope. It made that hope of the future real to him in the present. And not only that, but it also gave substance to his hope by now being the means by which that hope was expressed in action. He lived for God. He lived with God in the midst of a people who worshipped all kinds of other gods. Abraham lived as a stranger and a sojourner in the land, because he represented not this country, not this city, but the heavenly country and the heavenly city. And that's a regular theme through the whole of the New Testament. Like Abraham, we are called to find our true home in God's promise. Not in our earthly foundations, not in the bricks and mortar, not by our achievements, not by our networks, not by the fame and fortune that we have in this world. We too have the promise of a heavenly city. Revelation 3 says, "To the one who is victorious, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from God, and I will also write on them my new name." We have the promise of the heavenly city. Jesus has made that promise to us already in John 14. "In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you." We have a place. Our longing for home is fulfilled in Christ. All the Old Testament saints who looked forward to the heavenly country now receive it through Jesus, who made it possible for them and made it possible for us. The foundation of our home, then, the grounding for our sense of place, is the promise of God. And God cannot lie. This is why Hebrews says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We know that God is trustworthy, and therefore we can have confidence in His promises. What God says will be, will be. Therefore, although for now sometimes we don't see the fullness of those promises existing in our lives, although for now we don't see it, we can act and live on the basis of what God says, because that is ultimately what is true. And what that means is that we too then live as sojourners and exiles in this world. As Philippians 3 verse 20 says, our citizenship is in heaven. And so we live now as the citizens of heaven, the representatives of another city, even while we are travelling and living in the world. Now, none of that's meant to denigrate the goodness of God's creation or the world that we live in, but it does mean that we should live now as people whose true home, whose true place is given to us by God. It is God who is our security. It is God who is our belonging. It is God who is our true source of wealth. It is God who is the source of our identity. It is in God that we find our worth, our value, and our belovedness. Abraham actually did live in the land. He never owned it, but he lived in the land of Canaan. And Abraham became wealthy, and Abraham became powerful. And we hear at times that Abraham, by himself, the nomad that he was able to go to war against kings. He was a powerful figure in the land. But his true value, his true blessing, his true power, his true wealth was in the promise of God. Abraham therefore lived differently to the people around him because his ultimate confidence lay in a different source and in a different place. In the same way, Hebrews encourages us to believe in God and to believe that He rewards those who seek Him. Our confidence ought to be in the God who made the Word by His world, who made the visible out of things that couldn't be seen. And that confidence ought to show in how we live. We therefore don't need to be so concerned about our wealth, our status, our national identity, bank account, professional pride, or even our housing. Rather, we concern ourselves with the things of God, living in a way that's pleasing to Him, trusting that He is our great reward. At the end of our passage today, Hebrews says that God is not ashamed to be called the God of those who long for His city. Why is He not ashamed to be called the God of those who long for His city? Because He has prepared it for them. They're longing for something that is already true, that God has already prepared and made sure for us. There's no chance that God suddenly, on the day that you turn up longing for His city, is going to say, oh, sorry, I don't have one of those for you. No, He's prepared it, and therefore longing for that city is exactly the right thing to do. God is not ashamed to be called your God when you are a person who desires a better homeland. This is both the promise of an eternal future and the promise of the present day. God was in effect Abraham's home, his place, his blessing, and he was the possibility of being in a great nation. And God was with Abraham in every moment. And so we too have the promise that if we will live with God as our centre, our home, our security and significance, God will be with us right now. and also in eternity. To trust in God's goodness results in God's approval and commendation. He calls us His own, and when we trust that promise, He is not ashamed to be called our God. Yes, the book of Hebrews calls us to a courageous life. It calls us to step out in faith, to stand out from our neighbours, to live as citizens of the heavenly country. It calls us to find our belonging, our security, our significance in God. It calls us to find that the only real answer to our longing for a sense of place is to find our place in God. But ultimately, don't forget that the reason it calls us to trust God is because God is trustworthy. It calls us to find our belonging in Him because in Christ we do belong to Him. It calls us to find our place in Him because Christ has prepared a place for us. Our houses, our homes, our plans, all our securities will crumble with time. But the city of God is eternal, and the city of God is our true home. Amen.